Alaska Common Ground is a nonprofit organization and a nonpartisan organization that works to help Alaskans understand the major issues facing our state and reach consensus or common ground on those issues. Tonight's topic is the cost of Alaska's economic roller coaster. We have an excellent group of speakers and panelists to discuss this topic, and I'm happy to introduce John Tracy. John is a longtime broadcast journalist in Alaska who now advises on media affairs, and he has graciously volunteered to lead today's discussion.
I am the referee tonight, and I promise to officiate this like I'm doing a New Orleans Saints game. So anything can happen, and likely will. I want to let you know that there is a handout at the front door if you haven't received one, and it's pretty interesting. Lawmakers who are here look at it all the time, but this is basically tells you where our money goes. If you take a look at it, you can see exactly where our money goes, and if you can imagine what our largest expenditure is in the state of Alaska, anybody have a guess? Yeah, we pay ourselves dividends by a very, 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 very large margin. So take a look at that. What's really great for me as a former small business owner is to hear from a small business owner first, because small businesses are the ones that really are impacted at the ground level from what's happening in the state. So I would like to introduce a lifelong Alaska. Angela Libal is the business owner of Tidal Wave Books in Midtown. Please welcome Angela Libal. Angela, you can stand, you can sit, you can do whatever you'd like. You have the room.
Thank you, John. And thanks to Alaska Common Ground for inviting me. It's an honor. Thank you. So, Tidal Wave has been in business now going on 29 years, and as a small locally owned business, Tidal Wave has the unique opportunity to be almost like the small town post office or general store, in that we see families of all walks of life. We see retirees, we see young families who have just moved here with the military. We see every age range and demographic come through our store. And it's really quite a gift because we have then the ability to talk to those folks. What are they doing in Alaska? How did they come to be here? What do they do for business? What do they do for school? How do they parent their children? We're a part of that. We get to see generation after generation come through our doors. And in the economic instability, the roller coaster that we've seen, not only have we opened a second location and had to close that second location due to economic reasons, having to do with travel industry and the economic downturn in 2008, but also how that impacts our employees and staff and the people around us, the customers who come and shop in our store. We do get to hear all of their triumphs, their joys, but also their struggles. And as a used bookstore, we're buying books and merchandise from our customers, and we get to hear why they are selling their items to us, whether it's to bridge that gap between paychecks, whether they're on furlough, whether they're struggling raising kids. Textbooks are expensive, so we talk to all kinds of students. So we get to hear those personal stories and have that interaction that's on somewhat of a unique and intimate basis that maybe not everybody would get to participate and hear a part of. We've seen in the last 10 years a sharp increase in what people are looking for along the lines of self-sufficiency, being independent, and close that gap to not be reliant on the fluctuations in the grocery store, at the gas pump, and in every other aspect of their life. What could they do to control and mitigate and prevent some of those fluctuations? So I don't have any one single idea about how things can change, but I just know that in that interconnectedness and that web of ideas and the people that we talk to, that the solution is going to be something that is complex and, again, a web of interconnected ideas and steps that can be made together as a community.
Thank you, Angela. Well, our next presenter is Joe Schierhorn, and you know him as the Chairman, President, and Chief Executive Officer at Northrim Bank. We're very appreciative of you being here tonight. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for coming out on this afternoon for this important topic. It's interesting listening to you about your story of your business, because our bank started right about the same time, almost exactly. So in December of 1990, from one little branch in a trailer in our parking lot to what we have now throughout the state. And so we see businesses and what they are going through from the North Slope all the way down to almost the tip of Southeast Alaska. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that. The topic on instability and the effects that that has on our state, to me, one of the key aspects to that is uncertainty. And businesses, when they make investments, look for many times long-term returns. And if there is uncertainty out there in the form of our state budget as to the deficits that it is running, and whether or not the state government will have to look to business investors to solve some of that problem, then that leads to greater uncertainty. The greater the uncertainty, the greater the risk, and the greater the risk, the higher discount rate that's applied to those cash flows for those projects, and the business owner, investor, large or small, they have to make that decision as to whether or not those discounted cash flows make sense, make a positive impact in relation to that initial investment that they're making. This occurs from the basic real estate loan that our bank deals with to multi-billion-dollar projects that are occurring in Alaska. The higher the level of uncertainty, the higher the discount factor, the lower the cash flows, and the tougher it is to make those projects pencil. So over the last 6 years, there's been an out-migration of about 36,000 individuals from Alaska. And a lot of those occurred in the younger age groups. We see that in our business and in the businesses of customers. Fortunately, it's been made up a bit by the natural births outweighing deaths, but we're still slightly losing people in our state. I believe that that's another effect of the uncertainty. I'm an optimistic person. I think there's great future in Alaska. My vision for Alaska is to have a balanced budget. We all want that out there. So we're not focusing on the minutia of the struggle for each year and how we're going to make it to the next year. We need to be thinking much longer term to develop our state. And that goes throughout our state. We have huge projects that can benefit us, and the only way that they're going to benefit from us, for us, is through greater certainty to allow for private investors to be insured of that end cash flow that I was just talking about. So that's a very simplistic vision as we go forward. We have great opportunities up here if we take advantage of them on the natural resources, through our logistics, through taking advantage of where we're at. Tourism is growing greatly, and there are people making significant investments in that. That's a big benefit to us as we go forward. But we do need to come to a resolution because we have the ability to do that. John talked and asked you all what was the largest expenditure out there for state government, and a few people said healthcare. Well, really, under the current proposal, it's our dividend. That's about 37% of the revenue stream that's going into the state as proposed right now. 37%. Do we want a state that's the single major component? I'm not downgrading the dividend. I believe that in the best of all cases, we'd have a state budget that's balanced, that would provide for an ongoing dividend, but would also have other diverse revenue sources coming in. So we're not reliant upon the one topic that we just started this conversation with, and that's the volatility of our natural resources. We know that those are going to be volatile. We know the market's going to be volatile. So we need to account for that and have a steady cash flow as we go forward. Then we can have long-term investment that will move the state forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Our next speaker is a born and raised Alaskan. He currently works as business representative for IBEW, Local 1547, representing some 500 electrician journeymen and apprentices. Ryan Andrew. Ryan, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you to Alaska Common Ground for inviting me tonight to speak. What I'm going to talk about a little bit tonight is our apprenticeship program. When the apprentices the main focus is that they're trained right here in Alaska. It's about a 4 to 5 year program. The other part that makes it unique is that the apprentices have no tuition costs associated with that training. They just have to pay for their textbooks and their tools for the on-the-job portion of their apprenticeship, which is a great benefit to them. They get great training and at minimal cost to them. With the cost of the instructor in the apprenticeship school itself, they invest about approximately $25,000 to $30,000 in training each apprentice to get them through to a journeyman level. That's a pretty big investment in training these apprentices. And our ultimate goal is to have a journeyman trained and be able to stay and work in Alaska and have those work opportunities. The last few years we have seen with the economic downturn a lot less work opportunities, frankly, in the construction industry. If there is no work opportunity, much like other industries, these apprentices, when they're finished with their training, and some of the journeymen who have been trained right here in Alaska, they're leaving. They're leaving for the lower 48. They're leaving for better work opportunity. Imagine that you're a journeyman electrician, and you have to, you're faced with the decision whether you stay and have limited work opportunity, or you pick up your tools and you pick up your family and you move out of Alaska, which is what we don't like to see. Unfortunately, that's happening. Some of them on a temporary basis, but some of them also on a permanent basis. So the temporary, if they were moving just for a little while, that's still got an emotional impact on that family. They have to leave their spouse and children behind here in Alaska and go outside to earn a living. That's tough. That's really tough. So being able to diversify our revenue stream, I think that's number one, and that will give us financial stability and will attract investment from outside and attract business and keep our construction industry going strong. We want to see those folks be able to stay here in Alaska and not have to face those tough decisions.
Well, if you watch television news or read the newspaper, then you know our next speaker. Certainly, he's the go-to person for journalists. I spent more than 30 years being an enemy of the people, apparently. And whenever we had questions about the gas line or something complicated, it was ask Larry. So we would call and we would ask Larry. Larry has more than 20 years of experience as a reporter, editor, and newspaper owner in Alaska, followed by more than 20 years in public policy work at state, municipal, and federal jobs. And in his spare time, he just saves newspapers one at a time. Larry Persily.
Thank you. I'm going to stand so when I wave my arms, I don't hit anybody in the face. So I'm going to talk about municipalities and how they deal with the motion sickness of the roller coaster that we're on. And I will point out, as a kid, I would never ride a roller coaster. I've never been on one in my life because they scared me and I thought they'd make me sick. So it's kind of weird. I end up in Alaska and I ride a roller coaster for 45 years. Look, even though this is Anchorage, you got to remember there are 19 boroughs and 145 cities in Alaska. There is life outside of Anchorage. Over 100 of those cities and boroughs have a sales tax. This is an important part of their diversified economy, their diversified revenue flow. Anchorage, as we know, does not have a sales tax. It's not my fault. I have helped write 2 sales tax ordinances for Anchorage. Both have failed. I would have written a municipal income tax ordinance for Anchorage if anybody had asked me, though I really don't think it's legal under state law. In addition to the sales tax, a couple dozen have specific directed taxes, or at least more than a couple dozen. We're talking about hotel bed tax, cigarette tax, alcohol tax. In a 2017 survey of Alaska municipalities, more than 24 said they were looking at increasing their different excise tax, sales taxes to help make up for falling state revenues. In 2017, 14 municipalities reported levying a new tax of one kind or another as they're looking to fill that gap. But it's not easy in Alaska. Of the 15 boroughs that have a property tax, 12 of them have tax caps on the books, ordinances that limit increases, what they can do to raise sales tax if they need to replace state revenue. So that economic instability, that roller coaster we're talking about, it's pretty much going downhill one way for the municipalities. Where they're seeing it is reduced state reimbursement of local school construction debt, uncertain state funding of school operating costs, the things that are making it hard for municipalities, for school districts to retain, recruit talent. I think a big fear municipalities face deals with the pension liabilities of public employees and teachers. A decade ago, the legislature essentially refinanced the debt that is owed to the unfunded or underfunded public employee and teacher pension programs. The deal was, okay, municipalities, you're gonna have to pay more because we've refinanced it. You're gonna have to keep paying for another 9 years, but we'll set your contribution. The munis pay 22% of their payroll into the retirement funds. Anything over that 22% that is needed to keep the funds actuarially sound, the state will pick up. State will pick up that difference. This coming year, that difference that the state is paying is budgeted at a little more than $300 million. There are some legislators in the last few years, a few Republicans, who look at that and say, well, there's where we can cut the state budget. We can stop making up the difference from the state general fund. We can have the municipalities pay more into the pension funds for retired public employees, for teachers. Certainly that just passes, if it were to ever be approved, would just pass $300 million that you'd cut from the state budget and dump it on the municipalities. It's unpleasant, gets back to that roller coaster that makes you sick. Municipalities hoping that gets talked about but doesn't happen again. You see it in state cutbacks, in state funding for community jails, for municipal assistance, particularly for the state's smallest communities that really depend on that small amount of state aid for essential services. High visibility, state troopers. The cutbacks in the troopers have caused problems throughout the state. In Anchorage, we see it on the highways where the troopers used to patrol. The municipality doesn't really want to spend the money, so they didn't. Finally, the solution was a temporary state grant, so Anchorage police could patrol all the way to the southern border with the Kenai Peninsula on the Seward Highway. The Haynesboro troopers used to cover the Haines Highway. They're not there. The Haynesboro is wrestling with, can they send the Haines police out there? Who's going to pay for it? What's about the jurisdiction? Certainly, it also was a problem on the Kenai Peninsula Borough, where the borough operates the dispatch center in Soldotna that dispatches not just city police, but the troopers. Troopers aren't there anymore. There are some times during the day where there are no troopers out on the Seward Sterling highways, and that's creating a problem. So, okay, we go through the problems. What's the solution? The solution, as people have talked, is a more diversified revenue to the state treasury. So we're not just at the whims of oil or the political whims about a full dividend, a back pay dividend, where we're going to take away from the dividend to pay for schools. We need, in this political climate, it's probably not going to happen, we need to get back the discussion of a broad-based tax where economic activity in the state generates tax revenues for the state, for the communities, be it an income tax, be it a review of state corporate taxes, be it a look at a reasonable changes in oil taxes. It's going to take everything, or the roller coaster just continues. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry. Our next speaker is Greg Razo. Greg, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for everybody that came out this evening. So, full disclosure before I start in on my discussion, but I grew up here in Anchorage, so in terms of personal experience, I'm not qualified to speak about poverty in rural Alaska, but I'm going to. I can tell you that I've worked on the AFN Board of Directors for 16 years. I've lived in Kodiak, Alaska. I've been to the villages, but I haven't lived there. And so with that, my comments. When we were first asked to sit on this panel, the question that was the first question is, what in your experience have been the costs of economic instability? I thought about that, and the first thing that came to mind for me, and based upon what I hear from people that live in rural Alaska, Alaska Native people, is the increase in poverty. That is right up there with the increase in crime in rural Alaska. So the increase in poverty, the increase in crime, the lowering of economic opportunity for people in Alaska with this economic instability, and finally, a lower trust in government. And I think those are four significant things that we need to talk about and grapple with as we talk about what Alaska's fiscal situation really means to all Alaskans, not just the people that live in the urban centers, but the 60,000 Alaska Natives that live outside of the Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Juneau areas. So when we talk about poverty in Alaska, we're talking about Alaska Natives living in poverty at 2.5 times the rate of Caucasian Alaskans, 2 times the rate of the general population. So poverty in rural Alaska is a very real thing. And things like the permanent fund dividend make an extremely huge, significant, giant, extraordinary measure in terms of how people get by when they're forced, when they're forced to live in 2 economies because they choose to live in 2 economies. They live in a cash economy where that dividend makes a huge difference. But Alaska Native people also live in a subsistence economy. And they live in an area where, generally speaking, economic opportunity is difficult. There's not a lot of it. For those people that are fortunate enough to have jobs, many of the jobs they have are working for the government. If they don't work for the government in some form or fashion, then they'll work in some sort of resource extraction job. And those jobs are generally available to people that have some sort of job skill, and many in rural Alaska are unskilled laborers. So those jobs are, for the most part, not available to them. The consequence of this fiscal instability in Alaska, and when we look back at the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend, we see a huge, huge impact by the dividend for rural Alaska. The current situation in Alaska is untenable. It is being detrimental to the lives of Alaska Native people and, generally speaking, to the lives of people that live in rural Alaska. It's not just a matter of dollars and cents, because dollars and cents, when we come to state expenditure and making the decision to decrease public safety, to decrease public services, to have less state services available that are essential, really, to folks that live in rural Alaska, when those go away, they not only take jobs away, but they take opportunity away. We can't afford to take away economic opportunity from rural Alaska. So the point is, I guess, that the permanent fund dividend really is essential to the economy of rural Alaska, that it has served to decrease poverty substantially since it was created in 1980, and that the effect of the permanent fund dividend, and to some extent Alaska Native Corporation dividends to the income of Alaska Native people, has had a substantial effect on reducing their poverty. But poverty still exists in Alaska, and it exists greatly in rural Alaska. So until we can come to grips with our fiscal situation here, we have no hope of restoring the opportunity and the future for folks, especially our children. The importance of services in rural Alaska cannot be overstated. Those services are essential, and to even think about decreasing services, I can only tell you that it will have a negative effect on your brothers and sisters in rural Alaska first.
Thank you. And so our next presenter is the president of the CPA firm Schneider and Mode. Delighted to have you here today, Mark Schneider. Mark.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank you for being here. However, as an accountant, sitting in front of a big group of people, it's not the most comfortable position I've ever been in. I've been in Alaska as a CPA for 37 years, which means two things. Number one, I'm old. And secondly, I've seen a lot of the ups and downs. And so I'd just like to reiterate what we've already heard here, especially from the construction industry. What I see happening a lot with my clients, and I deal mainly with small businesses, is that they will, during the up times, they will increase their staff, they will train them, they will get them to the point where they're valuable, and then the economy can turn. They have to lay those people off. When the economy turns back up again, they're looking to hire, but the people that they've already trained are gone. They've either had to move out of the state or move to another job, and so they have to start all over again. And that's a big cost to the employers in Alaska that I see. Anybody who's an employer in here that has had to retrain its staff knows that it's expensive. And so that's what I see the most of. I've always thought that in order to correct this problem, I was hoping that somebody smarter than me would figure it out. And I'm not saying I'm smart, but I'm not sure if there's people that are trying to figure out that are smarter than me. And so I'm looking to the rest of the people on the panel here to have those suggestions that we can figure out where we can smooth out our economy so that we don't have these ups and downs in the future. Thank you.
Well, the other place that journalists tend to go to get information is ICIR. And so we are delighted to have with us somebody who actually crunches numbers for a living and tells us what those numbers mean. Wasim Gatabi.
Thank you for having me. I think the theme tonight from people that have skin in the game has been that economic uncertainty is costly, and that's something that's clear to all of us. As an economist, I specialize in pointing out the obvious, and so I'm going to be doing a bit of that over the next 10 minutes. I was reading an article, I think a couple of weeks ago, and there was a quote that I found fascinating. It's by the director of the International Monetary Fund, and she said that cross-country skiers and economies like the exact same thing. They like good visibility. When going down, they like very few hazards, and they like people staying in their tracks. And I thought, how perfect for Alaska, right? We like cross-country skiing, but as we've heard from people who have skin in the game, who make investment decisions, that having a predictable environment is absolutely key in making long-term decisions. And that's true for both households and for businesses alike, right? And so one of the things that we've heard is that people tend to move out when the environment is uncertain. Economics is a field that's filled with cliches. People vote with their feet. If the environment is uncertain, if I don't know whether or not I'm going to have a job tomorrow, then I'm unlikely to buy a house, I'm unlikely to buy a car, I'm unlikely to go out and spend money. Similarly, businesses are unlikely to hire our university graduates. Those university graduates are unlikely to stay in state, right? And so whichever dimension we assess, uncertainty has massive economic consequences. Last year, I was asked multiple times to try and quantify these economic costs of uncertainty. And so I went and scoured the economic literature, and I ended up finding a few papers that try and put some numbers around the cost of economic uncertainty. What those papers do is try to see what happens to investment during elections. Because elections basically may result in somebody winning that you may not like, what they end up finding is investments tend to go down in the quarters before elections by somewhere between 5 and 15%. Now, of course, that type of uncertainty is a much milder type than what we're currently experiencing. Now, I went ahead and I took those estimates that I just described and I applied them to our construction spending in Alaska. And what I found is over the last 3 years, in each of the last 3 years, Alaska basically could have had somewhere between $200 and $600 million in additional investment if there was no uncertainty. Now that means during those 3 years where we had those revenue shortfalls, we basically could have had somewhere between $600 and $2 billion in additional investment if the environment was predictable, if we knew what we were gonna do. We sit right now in a situation where we've already exhausted our savings and we have a $1.6 billion, with a B, billion dollar deficit. Now, the difficult aspect of this conversation is we still have not figured out who's gonna end up bearing the burden of this $1.6 billion, right? We don't know if we're gonna impose a tax, and if so, what kind of tax it will be. We don't know if we're gonna reduce the dividends, and if so, by how much. And we don't know if we're gonna cut government, or we do know we're gonna cut government, we don't know by how much, and what kind of services we're gonna end up cutting, right? And so what that ends up doing is basically causing paralysis by both households and businesses, and nobody's doing anything, nobody is investing any money. And so in addition to the fact that we no longer have savings, and I've had conversations that I find a little bit troubling in that there are people that think that government, there is this artificial separation between government and the private sector, when in reality, decisions that are made by government end up affecting the private industry. Salaries by government employees make a huge difference in our economy. And so at the end of the day, again, coming back to cliches, there is no free lunch. We sit in a situation where we're gonna have some very difficult decisions. There are trade-offs that need to be made. We're asking the permanent fund to do so much more than it did in the past, where it historically invested, grew, and paid out dividends. Now we're asking it to pay for a portion of government and pay for dividends. And yet we still have what was labeled by one of my former colleagues as the Alaska disconnect, meaning that even when the Alaska economy is growing and doing really well, there is no mechanism by which government revenues grow because we don't have an income tax and we don't have a sales tax. We have some selective sales taxes, we have license taxes. Larry pointed out that many a borough has a sales tax, but there are no statewide mechanisms by which economic growth ends up translating into revenue growth or revenue diversification. And so going forward, I think that we should prioritize stabilizing the economic environment for both households and businesses and setting a course that we think we can stick to. Of course, there are unknowns into the future, but we should do our absolute best to at least make sure that we know that there are some parameters that we're gonna abide by, as opposed to this kind of roller coaster that we've been undergoing. Thank you for listening, and I'll pass it off to you.
Well, I'd like you to stay on the stage. So my question for the audience right now, since dividends seems to be what we talk about when we talk about the permanent fund, every time we talk about the permanent fund, by the way, it always becomes a discussion about the dividend and not the fund. That's also part of the disconnect. So my question for this crowd is, and there is no wrong answer here, okay? My question, simply by a show of hands, who thinks that it's a good thing for the economy that you want and expect a full dividend? Okay. Show of hands for how many would think it's better for the economy, your family, and service to reduce the dividend and put that portion of money towards state services. Okay. So for those listening on radio, probably I would say a majority said that. So I wanted to preface that because that was not the results of the last election we had. There's a new sheriff in town, we all know that. The governor is proposing to cut $1.5 billion out of the budget without saying where those cuts are coming from, and at the same time proposing to return the so-called full dividends, as well as restoring those dividends reserves reduced over the past 3 years. And that is estimated to drain approximately a third of the permanent fund's earnings reserve in just the next 3 years. In the spirit of Stephen Colbert, when it comes to the long-term stability of Alaska's economy, which of these is a great idea and which is the greatest idea?
It's irresponsible to drain a third from the permanent fund. Also, even though it's called the permanent fund, there's nothing permanent or guaranteed about the investment returns. The permanent fund, the total fund, between October 1st and December 31st dropped $4 billion in value. So to drain a third because we want to make back pay to dividends, so it's irresponsible. Cutting $1.6 billion would decimate public services around the state. I just think none of those options are good. So we got to get another one in there.
Joe?
So to put it in perspective, the earnings reserve is around 15 or so billion, 16 billion, give or take. And the permanent fund right now is around 65 billion. The definition of a bear market is a 20% drop. So 20% drop in the permanent fund just about eats up that earnings reserve, potentially. And we're looking at utilizing a portion of those reserves now. So that's why it's important to have adequate reserves to be able to absorb drops in the market that are going to occur.
Yeah, I mean, just some specific numbers. You asked about the $1.6 billion cut. A few colleagues and I did an analysis a couple of years ago, and we estimated how many jobs would be lost from the economy if you were to close the budget through different reduction measures. And what we found that $100 million cut through state government layoffs translates into somewhere between 1,400 and 1,600 jobs. That's 100 million translated into the 1,400 to 1,600. And so if you want to get to the 1.6 billion, you would need to multiply that by 16. There are quite a few reasons to potentially be optimistic about investment in North Slope, about new finds, about construction spending, but all of that potential forecasting about the recession ending is contingent on us not making substantial cuts that would extend this recession. Pivoting to the permanent fund, I mean, there are two separate things. One is that, is there enough money to potentially do the back pays and pay the statutory formula? The short answer is yes. However, obviously there are trade-offs, meaning that the more money you take out, the less likely the earnings reserve is able to withstand some of those declines in, for example, the stock market. The more money you take out, the less it's able to withstand these fluctuations in economic activity. And then the second point is that when you take out money, you're foregoing future returns, right? Because you have less money that can potentially earn returns for the future.
Here's another question. Would an income tax or estate sales tax be helpful? And which is the best and fairest to Alaska's residents?
It depends. I come back to it depends on who do you want to bear the burden, right? And so income tax, if set in a progressive fashion, means that higher income individuals are going to pay more of the overall tax than lower income individuals. A sales tax tends to be more regressive because lower income households tend to spend more of their income, therefore they're going to end up bearing more of the burden. And so you can do both. You can do some combination of the two. And so I don't know that I ever think about it in terms of fairness. I think it's a decision that needs to be made about where do we want to draw this revenue from. And the reality is we have to make this decision about what part of the state. Is it non-residents? Is it all residents? Is it a flat tax? Is it an income tax? That decision will need to be made. And I don't know that we've had an honest conversation about raising revenues, and so I don't have a great answer, but I think that it really does come down to us deciding of who's going to be bearing most of this burden in order to pay for additional revenues.
Well, here's a question that just while we're talking about this, somebody asked, has any analysis been done to forecast what rate of an income or a sales tax would be needed to be implemented in order to balance the budget?
Right now, if you add up 4 categories of taxes, so selective sales taxes, overall sales taxes, and income tax and license taxes, what you find is that for Alaska, we pay about $530 per person. The US average is $2,600. Okay, so again, that means that if we were to get to that US average, you would collect $2,000 per person, multiply that by the people living in Alaska, and you would raise, $600-700 million. So an income tax alone, potentially, if we want to stay within reasonable ranges, is not going to close the whole budget gap, but obviously gets us much closer to making a dent into that gap.
If you've got $1 billion plus deficit and you want to close it with just a sales tax, not income tax, nothing else, you're looking at over 10% of a sales tax, and I'd say that high of a sales tax is really going to tank the economy. Real quickly, to answer the question, what's fair, income or sales? As you said, who do you want it to pay? I think what Alaskans need to keep in mind is the numbers I've seen over the years. An income tax would get more revenue from out-of-state residents, non-resident workers, than a sales tax. Yes, we'd get sales tax from tourists, but because of interstate commerce, you cannot tax the cruise ship tickets, you cannot tax the flights up here, because of state statute, you can't tax flight seeing in Alaska. So you eliminate the big ticket items and you're left with restaurants, hotels, and t-shirts. You'd get more money from non-residents with an income tax than you would a sales tax.
Interesting. If you had a choice between an income tax, a sales tax, or no tax, or both, would you prefer, who would be willing to pay in the $2,600 range? Let's make that clear, right? Average, $2,600 to pay an income tax. A show of hands. Oh my goodness. Wow. Okay. Yeah, I would. I've always said I would. I've said publicly that I would. I didn't pay a sales tax. So, how many would pay a state sales tax? Okay. Preferred state sales tax over. Okay, so not very many. So clearly, vast majority would prefer an income tax over a state sales tax. How many would be willing to pay both? That's close to 50% or more. How many would prefer to pay none? Well, prefer, okay. How many insist on paying none? I think if we all prefer, sure. Okay, that's interesting. What do you take from that?
Well, just as a comment on income tax, I don't think an income tax is going to fill the entire gap. So there's going to have to be a combination of different taxes if we're going to fill a $1.6 billion gap. If you look at what Alaskans, and this is not non-residents, but what Alaskans paid the federal government, and I think it was 2015 when I looked at the statistics, it was about, before any credits, it was about $3.4 billion. And so if we, one of the proposals is to base the state income tax on a percentage of the federal income tax that you make. It would make a very easy system, easy to figure out what your tax was going to be. If we took 10% of the federal tax that Alaskans pay, this does not account out of state, it'd be about $340 million. Obviously, if we wanted income tax to fill the entire gap, see if I can do that in my head, I guess they would have to be about 40% of the federal tax, and I don't know if that would be palatable by most Alaskans.
Do you feel it has been irresponsible for the Alaska legislature and governor to drain the state savings accounts since the start of this recession in 2015? And I'll just inform the question by saying the Constitutional Budget Reserve had over $10 billion in it, right? At the start of how much? 15 5 years ago, and it's now down to a little less than 2. We drained that account. That account still has some money in it. How responsible was that? And we continued to pay dividends.
Well, Actually, the Constitutional Budget Reserve was created in 1990. We voted it. It was a constitutional amendment. Since the early 90s, the state of Alaska, the legislature, at our behest as the public, has used money from the budget reserves and the permanent fund more than half the time. We've been living in a deficit for most of the past quarter century. Was it irresponsible? Sure. Did the legislature do what we asked them to do and spend money and appropriate money for stupid projects and good services? Yes, they did what we asked them to do. We did it to ourselves. But
Anyone
I don't
else?
feel that strongly.
But now we're down to $2 billion from $15 billion 5 years ago. So, and the constitutional budget reserve has kind of served as a shock absorber when oil prices changed after we budgeted, and it could be filled in with that. And we don't have that to fill in anymore. If we use 1.6 billion this year, it leaves us with $400 million in that account. So, whether it was irresponsible in the past or not really doesn't matter. It's where we are right now, and what do we do from this point forward?
What ideas do we have on the panel to actually diversify our economy?
So I think a couple of things. I know we've mentioned, we've been talking about a little bit about different types of taxation that we could be looking at. In terms of the last few years, we've had little to none capital budget for state projects. And that's a problem for the construction industry. State spending on construction is a big part of what opportunities we have in the construction industry. So one of the things that we've been exploring and have mentioned is the possibility of a general obligation bond to be able to pay for some of those projects that will keep our industry afloat in this down economy.
Where is education? They go on to say education is a part of the long-term solution, but has no voice or sense of urgency.
Education is extremely important to Alaska. It has been the secret of the success of Alaska Native corporations. I can tell you that for sure. If we didn't have, over the years, an increasingly educated workforce coming into our companies, we could not have the success we'd achieved. So education is hugely important. It has to be paid for, whether we're doing it correctly right now. I think that's a lot of people disagree on that. But it's extraordinarily important as something to invest in.
There are people outside looking at how we're doing. Wall Street, Standard & Poor's, downgraded Alaska severely over the past several years, but started to turn the corner a bit when the permanent fund, when the budget was cut significantly, and when the dividend was capped significantly. Wall Street paid attention, and Alaska's rating came up a bit. My question is, if we return to where we were, what happens to our recession? What happens to our rating?
What would happen if we went backwards as far as our long-term fiscal stability goes is I believe people will stop making the investments necessary to provide those jobs for the state. Investors make decisions based upon long-term results. And if they don't have certainty or some sense of stability in that, there'll be less investment. And if there's less investment, there'll be less employment. And I'm not going to guarantee you, but you saw the results of what occurred when the legislature put in place a mechanism to have a consistent draw from the permanent fund, and we made incremental progress on decreasing our budget. That had a direct correlation to increasing our bond ratings. And if we go backwards, the reverse is going to occur.
Where are we in this phase of recession, and where are we headed?
I think we're headed for a very dangerous time right now. If we're going to turn the corner on recession simply because we expect to have a few more jobs next year, a couple hundred more jobs maybe, and we all of a sudden decide that we're going to slash the state workforce, I mean, how counterintuitive could you possibly be, right?
I completely agree. My own forecast is that 2019, again, contingent on not slashing the budget, is that we do turn the corner. We are towards the end of the recession, again, contingent on potentially increasing the capital budget to deal with deferred maintenance and not slashing spending. I forecast somewhere close to 0.8% growth. Now, that 0.8% is a few thousand jobs at best. We've lost between 12,000 and 13,000 jobs over the last 3 years. So it's gonna take us, under the best case scenario, 3-4 years to recover those jobs that we've already lost. And that's best case scenario. So cautiously optimistic if we do the right things to not push us back into a recession.
So how optimistic is the panel that the legislature and the governor will hear you, will hear this, and do what you're suggesting and not slash state spending to the point where it hurts in the fashion you say it will? How optimistic are we? Good night. No, please. And why is it? Why are we not optimistic?
Well, I don't think we can judge from the audience in this room,
No.
nothing personal, but you're not representative of voters in Alaska. So I look at the last election, gubernatorial, legislative races. No, I'm not optimistic. I guess I'm hopeful, but I'm not optimistic. There's a theory in Alaska that it's going to have to get worse. We're going to have to hurt ourselves more before we figure it out. It's a political reality, I guess. I hope I'm wrong.
At gatherings like this, it's easy to sort of get divided and bang on one party or the other. I want to point out, in the interest of fairness, that there are plenty of Democrats that are asking for a full dividend as well. And the impacts that would stem from that are no different than anybody else asking for a full dividend. The difference between some of the proposals from that side of the aisle is that the money can be made up by increasing taxes on the oil industry. This is, again, going back to where we have traditionally gone to get our money. So I'm just going to ask the question, is that the direction the panel thinks would be wise to go or not?
You know, I love Alaska. I love living here. I'm here for the duration of my life. And so I want to see it do well. And I think we have to start looking farther than just the next year or two. You know, I lived in Portland, Oregon in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when logging was hit really hard. And the economy there went down the tubes. And it did in Seattle, too. And they did something about it at the time, though. And if you look at Portland and Seattle now, they're a growing, vibrant city. Too damn expensive to live in, and the traffic's really bad, which I don't want to see that happen to here. But we need to start looking at the future, and you know, I don't want to use the word diversify, but
You're not in my class. You're allowed.
somehow, you know, the oil still is contributing $2 billion to the state government coffers this next year, and at some point in time in the future, I've heard this ever since I've lived here, but those oil revenues are in fact going to run out, either because the oil itself runs out or because the nation or the world as a whole starts using different sources of energy. And we have to start thinking about how are we going to attract different types of industries up here. You know, we've never had much of a manufacturing industry. And so I guess in response to your question, as a short term, we might have to look at higher taxes on oil companies until we can find something else that is going to replace those revenues.
So we have a major industry that is the single largest investor in our state, period. This is a major source of capital, and we keep wanting to tap it to solve all of our problems. They need to pay their share, but the rest of Alaska needs to pay its share also. We need to be invested in this state. And we can't keep looking to solve all of our issues with one industry.
Just real briefly, I think politically, if it's always income tax versus oil tax or oil tax versus dividend, we'll never get the solution. It's got to be from everyone. Corporate taxes, oil taxes, individual income tax, looking at how much of a dividend's responsible but still meets needs for, it's got to be a casserole. Maybe not as bad as tuna noodle casserole, but it's got to be a casserole. Well, I like tuna noodle, but I think these people are higher end than that.
So we have time for just one more question, and I just want everybody on the panel to answer this question. What should we be doing to get off this roller coaster? What can you recommend that we do as Alaskans?
We as Alaskans have the opportunity, unique opportunity, I believe, because we have a small state. We can be engaged and we can make a difference. We can have somebody like Vic Fisher who's here that helped form our Constitution. Wow, that's pretty amazing. And many of us out there have had the opportunity to be engaged. So I just ask that you be engaged, you talk to your legislators, and you make a difference, because we have a unique ability to do that here, I think, unlike many other states. So take advantage of it and express your views as you have today, but out towards our legislators. It's just very, very important at this stage that we're in. Thank you.
I'd like to return back to the topic of education. I have on my staff 2 employees who are both studying to become teachers, and the upheaval that I've seen them experience in their lives over the last 3-4 weeks has been dramatic, looking at where they're going to go, what they're going to do. So I think just kind of looking across all industries, but also, of course, looking at education as well, to prevent some of the brain drain that we've been discussing.
Alaska used to be one of the best places for educators to come and work and earn a wage and earn a respectable retirement. So I think one of the things that we could do that would really do us well as a state in the future is for our system to return to a defined benefit or a pension type retirement account. So thank you.
I'd say, in addition to talking to your legislators, if there's anyone here who didn't vote in the November election, try to vote next time. And then the last thing I guess I'd say, until we get an income tax, for those of us who can afford it, there are a lot of nonprofits that provide services that state and federal governments had cut back on. We need to write them checks.
So a rising tide floats all boats, right? We've heard that. I believe that when you grow up here in Alaska, when you take advantage of living here in Alaska, you have the advantage of an education opportunity to live in a very diverse population with many different cultural values, that all of that is worth celebrating. And all of that has great value. When we go forward, if we recognize the value that lies in each and every one of us and realize that we make a choice when we live here, but when you make a choice, there's a price to be paid for that choice. Those are the things that we have to keep in mind if we're going to have a successful Alaska, in my view.
Well, I have to agree with you. I mean, this is a great place to live. As with all of us here, I've had a free ride for the last 37 years, and so I'm willing to start maybe paying my fair share of what it costs to live here. And that's, over the next couple years, we have to look at different sources of revenues for the state, income tax, sales tax, whatever it might be. But beyond that, we have to start thinking about farther into the future and diversifying our economy. And I think the state is the entity that can take the leading role in that. It's very difficult for each of us individually to start planning and of ways to diversify our economy here. But that's something that needs to be done, and I'd look to the state to hopefully take the leadership role in that.
Thank you. Musin, you have the last word.
Permanent Fund has $63 billion. The whole Alaska economy is valued at about somewhere close to $53 billion. I think what we need to do is make sure that we draw money from it at a responsible rate in order for it to be sustainable. It was meant to be a sustainable asset. We need to draw from it at a rate that's sustainable. And most importantly, we need to ensure that we're not myopic in implementing austerity measures that can have very long-term damaging consequences for the state of Alaska, its quality of life, and the services that it provides its citizens.
Thank you. On behalf of Alaska Common Ground, here's Dick to say goodnight.
Okay, I want to thank you all for coming, and I'd like to hear a big round of applause for all our panelists and speakers. And also a round of applause for John for volunteering to moderate today.